Ayla Begum. I am the program director of the Long Island Sound Community Impact Fund. We're based in New York and Connecticut, and we work for Restore America's Estuaries. And so this training is mainly about GIS mapping, sharing results and findings. And then, Marin, if we can go to the next slide, and I can just ground us for a little bit. And so before we get started, if you can mute yourself throughout the call, that would be great. We do have towards the end an opportunity for you to ask questions, and the trainer will also provide answers to the best of their ability. So a little bit about Restore America's Estuaries. We have several member organizations throughout the United States. We're a national organization. Our headquarters are based in Washington, D.C., but our program in particular is based out of Connecticut and New York, as I mentioned, focusing on Long Island Sound. And we just focus on restoring estuaries around the country and really just connecting communities as well. And so for the next slide, Marin. So as I mentioned, this training came out of the Long Island Sound Community Impact Fund. And for those of you who are not familiar with this, this is a partnership with RAY, EPA, and Long Island Sound Study, which is the National Estuary Program. And the purpose is to provide technical and financial assistance to environmentally distressed communities. So not only provide funding for their projects, but also provide capacity building trainings to be able to carry out a successful grant and project. So we've had several trainings throughout the duration of the grant cycle. We have about 18 subawardees finishing up this year, and so it made sense to hold a training based on GIS to be able to map their data, show their impact, just kind of a GIS 101, whether they wanted to present these to funders or just the community. It was a good way to kind of show people how to do that. So before we get started, I'll pass it to my colleague, Kelly Marty, and she'll be introducing the trainer.
Everyone, my name is Kelly Marty, and I'm the program associate for the Long Island Sound Community Impact Fund, and I'm with Restore America's Estuaries. And I'm going to introduce the speaker for today's training, which is Marin Karr. Marin Karr is a master's student at the University of Leipzig studying sustainable development with a focus on governance. Before attending graduate school, they worked as a community engagement and land stewardship coordinator at Dartmouth Natural Resources Trust, where they created story maps to assess the accessibility of parks owned by Dartmouth Natural Resources Trust in Massachusetts. And I'll pass it over to Mary.
Yeah, hello everybody. So I was recommended for this training as well by a former advisor of mine, also at Mount Holyoke, which is how Kelly and I got connected. And I've been doing GIS work and GIS studies for about 6 years now. I took my first class in GIS in 2018 at Mount Holyoke and sort of fell in love with the process of it. I like to think about GIS as problem solving. And when you're presented with a GIS issue or something that can be solved through geographic information and spatial studies, as trying to solve a big puzzle with the various layers that you're putting together and thinking about a real world problem and how you can think about that in terms of a two-dimensional solution. And that's sort of what GIS really is in some really basic terms. And we'll get more into that in sort of what comes next, sort of in these steps. So we've gone through the introductions. I'll talk a little bit more in depth about what GIS is. I'll introduce you to some of the more soft skills of GIS, which is the thinking spatially section. And those soft skills really do help to build on the harder skills of map creation and map building. They're really critical and they're really important for building maps that are understandable and readable to a person who's never done any map building before. I'll talk a little bit about where to get your data and how to organize your data. And then I'll leave you with some resources. I want to make it pretty clear that this is a sort of very broad bird's eye overview of what GIS is. And then the resources that I'm leaving you with, if you want to go more in depth on how to make a real solid map, those resources will help you dive more in depth into the specifics of how to make a successful map within a software like QGIS, which is free and open source and anybody can download it. So I highly recommend looking at those resources after this and delving into some of the tutorials that I have left you with. They're very in-depth, they're very good. Some of them are just under 2 hours long, and they'll give you a really good overview of how to actually build a map that is more step-by-step and less sort of broad than what I'm giving you. So that's where I will leave the introductions and the schedule, and let's dive into our content. So what exactly is GIS? So GIS stands for Geographic Information System or systems, and it most often involves the use of mapping software, either paid or free. The paid software are from Esri, which some of you may have heard about. They create the ARC family of products. So that's ArcGIS, ArcPro, ArcMap. And the free system of products are QGIS, Data Wrapper, Leaflet, Google Earth. Those last three I'm much less familiar with. I've worked very closely with the ARC family of products and QGIS. Those are my sort of areas of expertise. And you use those softwares to create visualizations, which are just apps or networks. And QGIS is just a type of technology that creates and manages and analyzes maps, different kinds of data. And it connects this data to a map, a visualization, and integrates locations with various descriptive information. So with what things are like and where they are, basically. And GIS helps users understand various patterns and relationships and geographic content. And the benefits are very wide ranging, so they can help improve communication and efficiency and management, as well as overall decision making. And if you have questions about specific content, you can leave them in the chat and we can get back to them when we come back around for the question portion of the webinar. So next we have, what exactly does all of this geographic information do? So first and foremost, GIS is data management. It's a foundation record-keeping system. You can store and integrate large amounts of data and display it in a useful way for you and your organizations. And you can also magnify certain types of data sources to be the most useful. And you do that through mapping and visualization, which is probably what GIS is most well known for. It creates digital maps and satellite imagery and 3D maps and real-time mapping. So GIS brings this data to life and visualizes these problems to help us solve these issues and create real-world solutions. And it uses spatial analysis to do that. So almost every type of data that you collect and that exists out there has some location component to it. Everything happens somewhere, right? So these spatial analyst tools that are in your GIS software, and I can talk more about what those look like, and the tutorials that I've left you with talk really in depth about what those look like, can help you reveal these patterns that are within your data. So those are the spatial analysis keys that give you your information. When you download data, it's in its raw form, and then you have to go through the process of analyzing it. And that helps you with communication. The reason why maps are so useful is because they can communicate these complex ideas of where something is in relationship to something else very quickly. That's the reason why we like looking at maps. Science and data build on this common understanding and support collaboration and problem solving. So when you have a well-made map, people can look at it and say, oh my gosh, of course, when you have more parks and green space, it reduces the issue of urban heat, as opposed to just saying that to somebody. When they can look at it visually on a map, it helps communicate that issue much more solidly. So here's where we're getting into sort of the idea of developing a GIS-focused mind and to think spatially. But what exactly does thinking spatially mean? It means to understand the world in terms of location and distance and direction and various relationships and patterns and scale. Spatial thinking, if you develop this skill, will allow you to see the sort of complex systems that interact and evolve across different landscapes. And it will allow you to answer questions like, where is a certain thing located? Why would it be located in one spot as opposed to a different spot? How is this connected to other locations? And how does it vary by location to location? And then the key aspects of spatial thinking are just general locational awareness, understanding various spatial relationships, recognizing patterns and distributions, using scale and perspective, and thinking in layers. And I want to bring your attention to the thinking in layers piece, because I think that's something that people who don't necessarily understand GIS or have no familiarity with it might not be quite understanding. So GIS works in data layers. And this graphic, I think over here on the right, is really helpful to understand that. So we have our real world over here, which is just, that's how you experience the world. That's how you go through it. And then your GIS layers are the data that you're going to pull in. They're what you're interested in. So say you're interested in looking at, I'll use the example of parks again, and urban heat. The layers that you're going to pull in are maybe the city that you're interested in. And then you'll look at the parks of the city, the park properties. So green space and the parks and water and tree cover, and then the urban heat map, for example. And those are your various GIS layers. And then within those layers is the hard data, and that's going to be displayed on the map. And that's all that a GIS map, a geographic map, composes of, and it's displayed in your GIS window, which can be a little hard to figure out the first time you're working with it, because there's a lot that needs to happen to get to a usable format. But we'll talk more about that when I show you a little demonstration of some of the things that I have been working on for you guys. But I think as you familiarize yourself more with the process of map creation, it gets a lot more simple, and you begin to understand how to think in layers that are useful for your organizations. So I wanted to do a quick exercise for about 5 or 10 minutes for you guys to think a little spatially and develop this spatial thinking mindset. So I want you to think of something that's relevant to your projects, your organizations. Either maybe it's a bike path or a farm or a subway station, a school, a park, anything that could be relevant for you. And we'll come back. I'll give you guys maybe 2 minutes to think about this, and then you can either put it in the chat or raise your hand and we can discuss as a group how you might want to think about displaying that information on a map. Who uses these services, where they might be coming from, what areas do these locations serve, and how are they accessing these places? So those are the kinds of questions that will get you in this spatial thinking mindset. So we'll say about 2 minutes to begin to think about this, and then we can come back and have a little discussion about it. And if you're ready before the 2 minutes, feel free to put it in the chat before the 2 minutes are up. Okay, does anybody want to share either in the chat or um, by raising their hand using the, where is it? Do I have it? There's or there used to be like a raise hand function in Zoom to share, or just shout it out if you're feeling confident.
I could say something.
Yeah, go for it.
Um, so, sorry, give me 1 second here. I do, I'm doing like a plant insect fungi project, and I have a bunch of points that I'm trying to show about like there's like a trail in this um in a field station, and so
Yeah,
I have all these points that I want to say like here's this plant of interest, and so I uh, I'm trying to think about like what do I want to do with these points and like how do I want to communicate those and like what is the purpose of making this map of where these plants are.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, I don't know. I don't know that I have anything else besides that, but I just wanted to share that like this is what I'm thinking about. And
Yeah, that's
um,
great. The first thing that sort of comes to my mind with a project like that is people really like color. Color is a great way to organize things, and a great way to display information. So if you have like 5 or 6 different plants or different insects or whatever you're studying in a certain area and you want to organize them so people can tell the difference between what you're seeing, organizing them by color is a really great way. So say if you have an area of 5 miles in a 5 mile radius, and you've seen a certain number of plants a certain number of times, and you've pointed it on a GPS. I've used the GPS markers, and I'll talk about that project a little bit later on. But you have those points where you've seen all of your plants. You can color code them in QGIS to show up as colored organized points on a map. So you can see the spread of all of the plants of interest on a map. you'd be able to color code all of the um, species of interest by color coding in your data. You might also have to use Excel to do that, but if you have the point location and the plant and an Excel spreadsheet, you would be able to do all of that and then display it on a map pretty easily, actually. You might have to do a little bit of Googling as well. That's one of the other things. I'll talk little bit about it a bit later, but if you have a question about something within QGIS, I guarantee you somebody else has also had that question. So with the right Google search terms, you can figure out the thing that you want answered. And people are really willing to help out because the data, because the app is open source, QGIS specifically, the community is really great and people really like helping out other people. So I highly recommend going on GitHub forums or Reddit forums even and poking around if you have more specific questions. But for a project like that, I definitely recommend something like color coding to display your information because people really like color and they're really drawn to that kind of information. And it would be really easy to display. You know, we saw 30 of these plants in this area and 30 of this fungi in this area, and it would be displayed really nicely. And you could pick a really nice base map as well that showed the satellite imagery of the area that you were looking at. I think if somebody else wants to, we can do maybe one more if somebody else wants to say anything.
2 comments or messages in the chat. I don't know if you were
Yeah,
able to see them. If you
yeah, I
want to
am.
come out. Okay, yeah.
Camille, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, said thinking about stream restoration and how aquatic life utilizes the stream, would want to display important data about stream temperature gradients on a map, use labels and color scales to visualize changes in stream temperature in temperatures along the stream. Yeah, that's a great example. And especially if you have all of the information about where the temperatures were and about the locations of where that was, that's a really great example of using gradient and using, again, color. Um, Color is sort of your greatest ally in creating a really visually pleasing map. Um, and there are some really great displays within the QGIS displays and the symbology page to create some really beautiful gradient maps. But I think this is a really good example of something that's sort of less um, social focused and more biologically focused because you can use, there's the sort of 2 aspects of GIS. There's the social GIS, which is what I'm much more familiar with. I've done a lot of social GIS work. And then I'm sort of less familiar with the more scientific side of GIS work. But using, it's the most important part of GIS is, I'll say location, location, location. If you have the longitude and latitude or GPS point of any data that you've collected, you can make a map with it. And so just keep that in mind when you are collecting information about your data sites or addresses. So those are sort of the 2 big ones. So if you have GPS points, which collect longitude and latitude, or if you're collecting information from participants, if you have an address or a close to an address, like a subway stop or a bus stop, but having something that has a location is really critical. And then the last one that got left in the chat by Brandon said creating watershed maps, clipping land uses / soils, improvisations, and ultimately impervious, and ultimately finding weighted curve numbers for hydrologic analysis. send to reviewing agency, engineers to back check, help to present in a clear and concise way when dividing into calculations for peak flows. Yeah. Again, I'm going to be fully transparent. I'm less familiar with the sort of hard science uses of GIS. Much of my work has been on the social side of GIS, but GIS is really, really good at using and creating, specifically with the other side of, there's two data types that GIS works with. There's vector data, which is the point, polygon, and line data, and then there's raster data, which uses satellites, satellite imagery. And a lot of the more hard science stuff, like the hydrologic mapping, watershed mapping, is going to use the raster data. And there's lots of really, really good raster data out there that would be really excellent for something like this. And again, like I said, the most important thing is that you have locations. But I think that you guys are already sort of in that mindset of wanting to think in that spatial way. And a lot of you are really focused towards the scientific aspect, which is really great. I wish my familiarity was more along that edge, and I could provide more sort of the hard science perspective. Okay, this will be the last one that I take for now, and then when we get towards the Q&A section, I can try to answer more of your project-related questions. But Becky says, measuring heights of bulkheads along a stream to understand where residents are likely to see flooding over bulkheads. That is a really, really good question. And there's a lot of really good flood work and flood analysis work from a lot of the various GIS databases. So a lot of people are interested in flooding because obviously climate change is going to increase the amounts of floods that we see. And so there's a lot of interest in flood management and flood risk analysis. And so the information that's collected for measuring things like flooding is really important. And when you take a measurement for the heights of stream bulkheads and things like that, just again, make sure you have the specific question that you want to answer. So where you're doing it and what you want to see that in relationship to. I think those are questions that we have to keep in mind, but you guys are already sort of most of the way there in terms of thinking spatially, at least from the questions that I've seen. The most important question is, how do we take these interests and the things that we want from our projects, and how do we translate that onto a map? So if you're interested in stream bulkheads and flooding, how do we take that question and translate it onto a two-dimensional map surface? So, and that's what I'm going to be talking about now with some of my previous work and projects that I've done. So talking to you about some of the work that I've done. So my first major project that I did independently of a course or a class was looking at environmental inequality and its impact on access to green space in Boston. This was my senior capstone project I did at Mount Holyoke. And this took me about 6 months to complete. So GIS projects can run on a time scale of anywhere from a few hours to several months. And I think that the longer projects are definitely the more in-depth ones and will take a lot of time and practice. I had been working with GIS at this point for 2 years and doing smaller, less complicated projects, and I was ready for something a lot bigger. So don't be intimidated by this map. This took a long time and took a lot of trial and error and a lot of mistakes. But it was ultimately very rewarding. And like I said, GIS and GIS work is like a big puzzle. So when you're presented with a problem, I was interested in looking at access to green space in Boston for the environmental justice groups. So I don't know if New York or Connecticut classifies it in the same way that Boston does, but Boston and Massachusetts classifies environmental justice groups in the census as minority, low income, and English language isolation, which basically just means, do the people in these homes speak English or have English as their primary language spoken at home? And that was the census group that I used for this analysis. And that is where I started with my main group of focus. And then I also did a lot of looking for the correct green space data. There was a lot that I couldn't use because obviously we're not looking at parks. We're not looking at green space that is inaccessible. So there's green space along highways, but obviously people are not going out there on the weekends to hang out along median strip. That's not safe. Nobody's doing that. So there was stuff within the data I had to get rid of. And so ultimately, we ended up with a few of these maps. And one of the other things that I was interested in looking at and ended up finding very interesting was where these roads intersected along these environmental justice groups. And I am going to move on a little bit quickly from this map. We can come back to it if people have questions about it, mostly just because I don't have access to the hard data anymore and can't sort of go into it and show you how this map was created. This one was made using ArcGIS Pro. So this is not a QGIS map. They have different interfaces and different looking software, so they'll produce different looking maps in the end. That's something to be aware of. So a lot of the professional government organizations use ArcGIS and ArcPro, and then a lot of people who can't pay the money that Esri asks for, which is quite a lot, will use QGIS, which is, I am not disparaging QGIS. I really like using QGIS, mostly because there's a really good community around the people who use it because it is free and open source. So I highly recommend working with and familiarizing yourself with QGIS over ArcGIS because you never know when you might lose access to it if you change jobs, if you suddenly can't pay for things because of grant funding, and ArcGIS and Esri products happen to be the things that get cut. QGIS is always going to be around because, again, it is free. So I recommend using QGIS over an ArcGIS and an Esri product just because it's free. So the next big project that I worked on, and this is sort of where that color coding and making sure you are always taking a location is really important. This was the disability access project that I worked on for about 6 to 8 months when I was doing my AmeriCorps year in Dartmouth. This project, Kelly, did you end up sending the links out to this project? Okay, well, they are in the slides, in the notes for this set of slides. If these get shared to everybody at the end of this, you can go look at the full projects. I've linked to 3 of them. Basically, what this involved was taking a GPS that had the ability to take points and going out along every single one of DNRT's trails. They have over 40 miles of trail, and taking a picture on my phone and marking on our GPS a point every time I ran into something that could be considered an obstacle for someone with a disability. And we came up with our own assessment criteria of what accessibility looked like and what disability access looked like. and that is on our website. It's under maintenance right now, so it's not posted on the website, on DNRT's website. But I went through all 40 miles, took lots of pictures, and took lots of GPS points and put those all into Excel files. And then those Excel files eventually ended up on a story map. And I believe Story Map, which is an Esri product, is available without a full license, paid license to Story Map. So any organization has access to it. You just may not have access to its full capabilities. But Story Map is really useful if you want to display pictures and you have something that you'd want somebody to be able to scroll through and look at. So this couldn't be displayed in one piece because it's going through a series of steps and information. We wanted it to be able to, if you started in the parking lot of Construction Brook Woods, which is this trail, if you started in the parking lot of the Red Trail, you wanted to be able to go through what it would look like on an average day and see what obstacles would be there on an average day. And that is what I went through for all, I think at the time it was 25 different properties of DNRT. So it was a long project, but very rewarding. And that's just one example of where story maps can be used. And they're very useful, even if you don't have the full access to all of the various tools. But I highly recommend taking a deeper look into what capacity story maps might have for your various organizations. And then let's see, this was a project I did for one of my courses in grad school. We were comparing two different cities. We were looking at Dublin and Edinburgh. And this was just sort of mapping the various amenities that were in Dublin. And this was a much smaller, much faster project. One of the things to keep in mind about GIS work is there tends to be a lot of upfront work. So getting your map to a point where it's usable can sometimes feel like it's a lot of work. You have to combine a lot of layers. You have to create a lot of different information, and then you're finally at a point where it's usable. So that's sort of what this Dublin map, I wanted to include it. We had to combine all of the different neighborhoods in Dublin to create this Dublin city boundary. And then we did that, and then we were sort of analyzing the various locations where all of the businesses were clustered. And that's what this other map on the left is, this business clusters Dublin. And we were sort of trying to see where the main businesses were all located, which obviously is the city center. And then I want to dive much more deeply and in depth into this map, which I have much more access to because I made it for our demonstration today. So this is looking at the Hudson River and bike access to the Hudson River from Grand Central Station. This is what's called a network analysis, which can be incredibly useful for a lot of your organizations when you want to look at a service area, trying to find the shortest path from a point to another point or a location. And I'm going to do a quick demonstration of where I got this information from and what this information is looking at. So I'm going to share my other desktop really quickly and do a little demonstration about where to get data and how to build a map. So the first place I went to think about this was the NYC Open Data Portal. So that's the New York City Open Data Portal. So this has mostly geographic information. I haven't really looked at what other information it has, but this is all the information that could potentially be interesting for geographic information. And so first, I'm mostly just going to show you how to download a data set for this project, and then I'll go and show you the actual map. So because I was interested in the Hudson River and access to the Hudson River, I looked at this data set, this publicly owned waterfront. And if I click into it, it says publicly owned waterfront. So that's the name of the set. And then it has this little description here. It says city, state, and federally owned public parks and facilities that provide waterfront, parkland, and open space for public enjoyment as shown on the waterfront access map. And if you click into that, it will show you, if it loads, the map from the NYC planning. You may have to zoom in a little bit. Let's see. Sometimes it can be, let's see, is it gonna? Ah, yes, here it is. So this is one of the public parks, the public access areas. And if you click into it, it says Riverside Park. And then you can scroll down. The NYC database has really well organized data. And most governments, so the New York City database, the New York State, the Connecticut Open Data Portal, their GIS databases are very well organized, which is why I will recommend to you and your organizations that you either get your data from your own organization or from governments. So state, federal, or local government, just because they tend to have stricter standards on how they are organizing and labeling and providing their data. So it'll have an about section. That's what this is, when it was updated, when it was first created. And then it'll have a sort of what's in this data set section, where it says each row is a publicly accessible portion of a waterfront that is publicly owned. And then it'll show you what all of the columns are and a description of those columns. This is really, really important. I cannot emphasize enough how important this is for every data set that either you are making for your organization or that you find. If you don't have something like this and it's sort of unlabeled, you eventually will run into the issue of you have a column that you've labeled something that you think you will remember, and then you go back to look at it and you've labeled it something ridiculous, which I have done before, where I'm like, oh, I'll remember what this is. And then you look at it and you're like, I have no idea what this is. And the things that are in the column, you think will give you a clue, and you have no idea what they are. And then you spend an hour trying to figure out what it is. So please, if you are making your own data sets, make a description table as well within your data set of what your data is. Please, please, please. I cannot emphasize doing that enough. It will save you hours of headache down the road. But to download something, you'll go to export. You can download as a CSV, as just like an Excel file. But for GIS data, you're either going to download as a single GeoJSON file, or some people will recommend a shapefile. I prefer GeoJSON files just because it's a singular file. Shapefiles, I believe, are 3 different files. So you'll click download, it'll export itself. It may take a little while. If this continues to take a little while, I'll just jump ahead. Oh, no, we're good. It'll open itself in a different, it opened in a different window. Give me a second. I moved it into my folder that I have saved. Let's see, can you guys see my QGIS folder? Yes, okay, great. Yeah, so here's that data set. It's the publicly owned waterfront GeoJSON. So I'm going to minimize this, and I'm going to minimize that. And here we have our base map. So when you go to download QGIS, and if you follow the tutorial or any sort of tutorial, they will talk about these things called plugins up here. And one of the ones that you can install is the OpenStreetMap standard, which will give you a very good base map. And without it, you will just sort of be left with a blank map. And so when you put your data in, you just sort of have the polygons and no street information, which some people initially like to do their data like this. I think it's kind of confusing because you don't really know where you are. So that is how you download data and can display it on a map. Here we are. Grand Central Station is somewhere down here. Central Park, beautiful New York City. Obviously, I'm not very familiar with it. I'm from Boston. Oops. Wrong city, rivals, and all those things. I'm not really a big sports person, so I don't really care. But now I'm going to go and open up our actual map that I'm going to, I will not save that I actually want to share. Is it not open? Is it already open? Oh no. Uh-oh, technical difficulties. Let's see if I can just open it. Okay. There we go. Don't save. And I spelled bikes wrong. Please ignore my typo. Okay, here we are. So this is our beautiful network analysis looking at bike access to the Hudson River. And why might that be important? You might be wondering. Well, for obvious reasons, some people may not have a car. The Hudson River is, at least the last time I was in New York, was nice to look at. And rivers are really, I think, a wonderful part of our green and blue space infrastructure in all urban areas. So, and I think that especially in a place like New York City, where a large percentage of people probably don't have access to a car, using something like public transportation and looking at access from bikes and for walking, I would assume this was probably the fastest route as well from walking could be an important question to ask. So one of the important things when looking at a network analysis is that you have something called a network. And a network is basically any set of line data. So these are all points, the boat launches, which is what I used for the river access. And the network access is this New York City bikes. And that is a set of line data that I got from the New York City Open Data Portal. And that covers the entirety of New York City, if you look at it. So this is all of the various bike routes across New York City. But of course, I'm really only interested in looking at Manhattan right now. And so one of the things that's an important skill to learn and why labeling your data is so important is filtering your data. 1 second, open in the wrong side. So this is the hard data. You'll notice it looks a lot like an Excel spreadsheet. Being able to filter your data. So one of the things that it will have labeled in your data description is what each of these means. And see, it says borough here. So this one, I believe, corresponded to Manhattan. So I went in and I filtered for all of the bike routes that were in Manhattan, and then I cut everything else out since I was only interested in looking at Manhattan. So I got rid of everything else and I made a brand new folder, not folder. I made a brand new bike routes, which was just the bike routes in Manhattan. So if I zoom out now, you can see that the only bike routes that are showing are the ones that are in Manhattan. I'm going to turn that off so it's a little bit easier to see. And then obviously I downloaded this publicly owned Waterfronts New York City, which is the one that I showed you. And then the other one that I downloaded was this public waterfront public access areas, which is a different data set. That is the privately owned, it's waterfronts that are privately owned, but provide waterfront, but the owners provide waterfront access, which I figured was also potentially an important data set to look at. It turns out that none of these boat launches were along any of those private waterfronts, private access areas, but I thought it still might be important just to look at. And then this other one that I looked at was the boat launches, and I did the same thing where I filtered out all of the boat launches that were not that were outside of Manhattan. And then the final thing that I did was I created a point using the edit tool, and I just drew a point on the map as close to Grand Central as I got. I was a little bit off. And I used that in my network analysis. So I used what was called shortest path. And the tutorial that I've linked, which I keep on recommending, which will do a much better job than sort of this fast overview. It will actually walk you through how to download QGIS and how to do some of this step by step where you are following along. I did shortest path, and the points that I used were this Grand Central point, and then these points along the river. And it created this Hudson River access by bike points, these lines. It actually created all of these other lines, so it'll create an individual line data set. A line vector file, basically. And then I combined all of those into one singular file right here, a singular GeoJSON file to make it a little bit easier to turn on and off, as opposed to turning on and off 6 or 7 different files, which is a pretty easy thing to do once you get more familiar with the software. So that is what I created for you to look at. And I didn't do all the points. I left off a few over here for simplicity and making a more easily viewed layout on the map. But that was sort of this project, all told, for me, as somebody who's fairly familiar with the software, it took about 4 hours from sort of thought inception to finding the correct data to all of the various analysis pieces and narrowing everything down to exactly what I wanted it to look like. And that was sort of the example I came up with of something a little bit on the less complex side of what GIS is capable of. And I'm now going to go back to the other screen that I have, my slides. And I'm going to talk a little bit about data, and then we'll get to our questions. So like I mentioned earlier, most major cities will have a GIS data portal database. So New York City has one. I know Boston has one. I would imagine most of the major cities in Connecticut also have one. If you look up your city plus GIS database, you'll probably get one. And then almost every state has a well-maintained, that I've experienced, has a well-maintained database. So if you just look up your state plus GIS database, you will get a .gov result. And then some universities keep GIS records, publicly accessible records, but it's less likely. And you may have to ask for specific data from a university, which is why I tend to use .gov resources when I'm asking and working with GIS data. And I'm very hesitant to pay for GIS data from private companies unless it's like 100% necessary. If you are working with a private company and they provide you with GIS data, that's a different situation. But I would be really, really hesitant to pay for private data unless it was truly 100% necessary. And then another thing, I think I went through this already, sort of what makes high quality data and just making sure that you are always keeping track of your descriptions and what everything is, sort of keeping track of the column name, what that means, what the description is. It is really important. It will save you lots of time and headaches. And then sort of the last thing is, and maybe I'll share my screen again and show you my organization in my QGIS browser, is how do you want to organize all this? It can be overwhelming when you start working with a new system that you might not be familiar with. And ArcGIS and QGIS are somewhat particular about their files and their file storage. And if people are computer science people, they may have run into this before. But make sure you have a file organization system that works for you, because you will end up with more files than you expect. Every time you do an action in GIS, so every time you make a new point or you plot something or you create a new section, a new layer in your map, you'll end up with a new file. This is why things, if you get more into it, things like geodatabases are really useful because they store all of it in one place. And something that tutorials may not mention, but something that I was always taught is never ever put spaces in your file names. It can confuse the program. So always label everything with an underscore. So I put this example in here and I can go and I'll share my other desktop again. So this is you can see here that I didn't make that one. Ignore some of these. None of my personal file names have any spaces in them. They're always labeled with an underscore. So you have bikes underscore points, or you have the bike routes for Manhattan is bikes underscore routes underscore man, which is an abbreviation for Manhattan. And you should label things in a way that makes sense for you, that you'll know what it is. But I always label things where you would use the space traditionally. I would always put an underscore. And that's just the way that I was taught to keep your program from to keep it from misunderstanding what you've written. And then my system right now is not as organized as I would like it to be within this folder, but if we close it down, I have various projects and things. Normally I keep it organized by project, and within that I keep it organized by different project within those projects. So if I have two different maps I'm working on within a singular project, I keep it organized by map within project. And I think we are now getting towards the end and I can start taking questions. This very top tutorial here, the very basic QGIS tutorial from 2024, is the one I'm recommending that everybody take about 2 hours out of your day to sit down and watch and go through. I've done it just to see what it was like, and I found it very useful, even for me as a, somewhat seasoned veteran, even as just a refresher on what QGIS can do. And it's from 2024, so the layout of the app won't have changed very much. And it'll go through installation, different data types, what your layers are, the difference between vector and raster data, and how to work with both of those data types. And I found it very useful. I highly recommend everybody who wants to make different maps start there and then go bigger. And then the second one is from 2022, so it's a little bit older, but it is 71 tutorials. I've not gone through them all. I've done some of them when I've wanted something a little bit more specific, and they're much shorter. So I don't think any single one video is more than 25 minutes, but it'll have more specific information. So if you're looking to do something more specific with raster data, like looking at different hydrology and where runoff is, that's something that raster data might be able to provide for you. This may have that within those 71 videos. And then I've left some resources that I have found for where you might be able to find useful data for you. So I've left some for Connecticut through the Connecticut GIS Open Database and through Yukon, and for New Jersey and New York as well. So those are the New York State and New York City open data portals, and then the New Jersey Geographic Information Network and the EPA in New Jersey as well. And I think I will wrap it up there in terms of my content, and I will open up the floor to questions, either just shout them out or in the chat. And I think I'll start with the questions in the chat. The first one I'm seeing is from Doug. You asked, when you used your phone, did it give you a precise reading or the closest cell tower? That's a really great question. I was not using the location data on my phone. I went out with a handheld GPS that was also able to take a point location. So I can't remember the exact type that we used, but because I was also working with a land trust that was taking, that needed to take specific location information for various reasons, like where property boundaries are, we had GPS that could take point information. So I would go out with one of those and my phone, and I would take a picture of something that would be, say, a rock wall would be blocking the trail. There'd be a rock wall in the trail that you'd have to step over. I would take a picture of that, and then I would mark on the GPS where that was, and I would label it within the GPS. It had a keyboard as well. So I would create a folder within the GPS for that trail that I was working on, and they would be sort of linked together. And then when I would get back to the office, I would upload that to a specific folder that I had on my computer. So that's how I would do that project. And let me see if I can go back, and if people are, I don't know if people are interested in seeing this project more specifically, but I can sort of share what a story map looks like. So that's my old name there, but this is what a story map can look like. So we have all of our property information here, a link to view it on Google Maps, and directions to it. This was all from our website, and then some broader accessibility information. 1 second. Parking information, comment about that this is one of our larger reserves, and then some more specific accessibility information. And then this was one of our trails. So we had the trail information, and this was just the plotted points. And you can see here as I scroll, you can either click in to see the points. So this is a picture of our parking lot. And as I scroll through, it's got both the description and it's scrolling, so it lights up the point. And you can see sort of where all of the various spots are. You can see where the trail splits. And I mentioned that if you want to continue, you'll go to the left. And I mentioned that the, trail is wide and flat and things like that. And that goes on for this trail. And then if you wanted to look at the yellow trail, you would scroll past this, or you could click up here and go look at the other trail that we have. So that was that project. Let me take a look at the other questions that might be here. Okay. Any other questions that people might have for me?
I have a question.
Yeah.
It's sort of specific about, I was trying to follow along when you were doing you started adding the plugins.
Yeah.
And there was the plugin, the what was it? OSM standard or something?
OSM, so that stands for OpenStreetMap Standard, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with OpenStreetMap. It is I think they're a community open source mapping group, and they have their mapping, let's see, OpenStreetMaps. Yeah, they have all of their data publicly available, and they just have their map that you can plug in to GIS. And that's one of the GIS plugins. So this is the same map that I have with GIS, and it's one of the most commonly used plugins because it's also open source, which means that it is free. That's why QGIS uses it. So Esri has their own fancy base maps that they use with their maps. And they have their own satellite imagery that Esri uses. And QGIS tends to use open data because of the nature of it being a free. Sorry, I totally jumped in front of what you were asking. But
That's okay.
yes.
It's fine. What I was going to ask was, I was trying to look up the OSM standard in the plugin, but I could only find a lot of other stuff. So I was wondering, is the OSM standard something you have to, am I not seeing it because of something on my end, or is there something I
It's
have to
called
do?
Quick OSM is the plugin.
Okay. There it is.
So these are all the plugins. Feel free to take a screenshot of the plugins that I have. I'll leave this. Can you see the installed plugins if I have this here? Are you able?
I'm seeing your Google search. I don't know if that's what you.
My Google search. Okay, let me share my screen again and just share my whole desktop. So are you able to see now my installed plugins?
Okay, wait, yeah, hold on, let me just.
Yeah. So
There it
these are
is.
all the installed plugins that I have on my GIS, my QGIS. And these are all the tools the sort of basic tools that I use on a regular basis, that were either recommended to me, or that I've gotten from various tutorials and things that I've done. The the ones that I find most useful are the quick OSM, the quick map services, and the processing tools. I would say if you don't get any other plugins when you download QGIS, those three are the most critical. And then these other ones do more sort of complicated things. But the processing tools are going to do sort of your basic geoprocessing stuff. And then the quick OSM is a OpenStreetMap search tool. And then the quick map services will help you search and add OpenStreetMaps to your maps. But yeah, feel free to take a screenshot of this, and I can take a screenshot of my plugins and send it to Kelly, and you can include this in the resources afterwards. But these are all my basic plugins that I use on a
Cool.
regular basis.
Yeah, thank you.
The plugins were something that I definitely had to get used to when I switched over to QGIS because when you work with Esri, it's a matter of what your license is. So if you have your organization subscribes to like a full license, you'll have access to all of the various geoprocessing tools, and you'll have access to like the full suite of everything that you're able to do. But if you have a basic license, excuse me, to if you have a basic like Arc Pro license, there's only certain things that you'll be able to do, which is really frustrating, and I find that kind of ridiculous personally. But I understand, it's like Photoshop where they have to squeeze every cent out of you. So, but that's sort of a soapbox I'll get off of.
Thank
Are there
you.
any other questions that people have?
You have
Marin?
another question.
Yeah.
In the chat, it's by Carla Avila.
Yeah. Carla said, would story maps be best suited to tell one story/project at a time, or can it be organized to have similar projects added over time? I'm thinking there will be 30 plus projects. I think it really depends on the project. There are some really great examples of story maps that various governments and thesis students and people all over the world have posted. I recommend going through and just looking up something I don't know what your project is, or what projects you might be working on, but you could probably find something similar. They tend to be telling one single idea. And if you have multiple projects related to that idea, it could probably be communicated with a single story map. They can have a bit of a learning curve because they can be persnickety. They sort of do one thing really well, which is like scroll from top to bottom and display like information will pop up when you scroll. The ones that I did for DNRT were fairly simple, but they can display really cool information in very interesting ways if they're designed properly. I haven't done a lot of work with story maps beyond what I did for DNRT, but the people who make the really, really fun and interesting ones, which I could probably find and include and make a more sort of longer resources page and send it out in the next couple of days to Kelly to send to you guys. That includes some story maps. Have a lot of really interesting information and have it sort of pop up in cool, fun ways. And there are tutorials for that as well. I've just never used or needed to use story maps in sort of my career. And I think they're a really good way. I have often found that the best story maps, though, keep it to one sort of theme or idea. So if you're trying to tell a story about like urban heat, they keep it to one project or one place about urban heat. Or if you're talking about park access or floodwaters or things like that, they're talking about one place. Um, Otherwise, I think because of the way that you look at a story map by scrolling, it can get confusing the longer it goes on and on because they can be quite, some of them can be quite long that I've seen.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that answers my question. I was thinking of doing a story map telling just like sharing information about all of our restoration projects that we have, but it sounds like splitting them up and they're not related really, just under our restoration program. So it sounds like it would be best to have a story for each specific project because some of them are so totally different. But thank you so much. That was helpful.
Um, you could have one like overview story map that gave that showed where each one was and then gave like a brief overview of like what each project was, but I wouldn't go in depth into it. Um, it would I'm I like talking about projects. I find them all very interesting, and I think trying to find the best way to display information is really fun. Like I said, they're like puzzles to me. Um, but yeah, I think if you had sort of a larger map with points, and then as you scrolled, each one would like light up with a little bit of information, but I wouldn't go more in depth than just like 5 or 6 sentences and some pictures and just like a point on a map. But you could have it in one place and then more in depth somewhere else if you wanted to have it in a centralized location. That's sort of where my thinking would be on that. Because I do think centralized places are really good for information. And I think story maps are good at having a centralized location, but they can get overly complicated if you try to include a lot of information. So finding the balance between too much and too little, I think is possible. Um, but I think there's a line there, and I think it could be done. Um, but if you want to have the most information about each of your projects, then an individual page or map is probably the best way to go. But if you want an overview, then you can probably do it in one story map.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great idea. Having like the overview and then linking to potentially the longer ones with more information. Awesome. Thank
Yeah.
you.
hmm
So if there are no further questions, thank you so much for Marin. And so we'll be emailing the recording and the slides to you. And then if you want to sign up for our newsletter, please feel free to do so. And you'll be posted on upcoming trainings that happen virtually and in person. And I also did want to plug in our annual learning exchange, which will be held on June 30th. So that'll be in person with several trainings going on, along with several of our projects completing their course and new projects coming in. So it's just like a networking opportunity. But yeah, any other final thoughts or questions before we give back a few minutes of your day? Okay. Well, thank you everyone for attending, and thank you, Marin, for leading this training.